Hello, everyone. My name is Hadar Shor. I am the director of the Middle East, India, and Africa desk in the Israeli Foreign Trade Administration of the Ministry of Economy and Industry. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Nia and John, the organizers, for inviting us as a ministry to speak here and try and open a window to our efforts with our friends in the UAE and the general efforts of our ministry with the fintech industry. I can say that in general, these are very exciting times. We have been working on putting to the ground the wonderful agreements, the Abraham Accords that were signed in the White House a few weeks ago, that these days need to be implemented on the ground with professional people and with the governments putting their hands together to try and get it for the companies on both sides, and to get that benefit of this wonderful opening of doors and shaking of hands that were not very familiar in the past few years, and getting the benefit of this for the Israeli and UAE economies. I can say that me and my team have been working on this matter in specific for the past few weeks. Alongside, I'm happy to announce that we will be opening our 46th commercial office in the UAE in the coming months, alongside with our friends from the Israeli Foreign Affairs Ministry. As usual, as we do in different business capitals around the world, we take specific interest in the UAE as a business center, and this is why we will be opening our commercial office over there with an Israeli commercial attaché that will be sitting there with the local team to help both Israeli companies get into the UAE market and also UAE business people finding new interests and investments in Israel. I would like to give a short intro about a brief overview of the ecosystem in Israel for our UAE audience, and maybe a few points in end for the Israeli players that are planning to enter the UAE soon. So let's start first with some figures. And actually, when I went through the figures, I was amazed to see how similar the countries are. It's both young countries, many migrants getting in, a very diverse population that comes out from that, both in a pretty challenging geopolitical situation, but still leading their regional economy. And I believe was the book in Startup Nation that mentioned few of those points as the best infrastructure for a diverse, high-tech economic diversification that will allow very fruitful engagement between the two markets. And this similarity, I believe, works for both sides. Israel, with more than 300 multinational corporations sitting in it. 13% of our GDP comes from high-tech technology, and we have nearly 4,000 startups, a few hundreds open every month. Out of them, almost 500 are specifically dealing with fintech. Israel is a powerhouse of tech. I can say that Israel is a powerhouse of tech in the Middle East. Finally, after many years that we had a lot of pride of ourselves as a global market, a lot of our companies always think globally. Our market is very small, and it used to be very secluded. This is why most of our companies, especially in the fintech sector, we're always looking out, always looking globally and always global ready. I can maybe say that we can finally think a little locally now when we have very friendly neighbors with a vast infrastructure and a financial industry. I think that our Israeli companies and players can finally think a little locally a bit more. Maybe talking about the fintech industry or our ecosystem for the UAE audience, that in Israel we count or we see the ecosystem as the amount of deals and actually amount of money that's being flowing in it. And I can say that we, in our numbers, can see that there's a very strong growth of fintech deals and in the fintech industry in general. We're talking about a growth from around $580 million in 2015 to almost $1.8 billion in 2019. This is a 5-year term where you can see a humongous jump in fintech ecosystem and the industry that actually moves forward. We also have a few fintech, as they call it, unicorns, which I believe is a big differentiation. Even though we count deals as, let's say, the thing that puts our industry into motion, those unicorns or the big companies that are deciding to stay here in Israel, I think will allow this industry to keep prospering. And I believe that our partners in the UAE can definitely benefit and even contribute to these kind of companies, the companies that decide not to take the exit or move on, but to stay in, put the effort and expand internally and locally in order to put an extra emphasis and an extra footprint inside their industry, in this case, I'd say the fintech industry. One of the big strengths, again, mentioning maybe the obvious for the local Israelis, but something that I believe is important to mention, is the crossover that we have in tech. Specifically in the fintech ecosystem, I see a lot of similarities and a lot of overlap that we see in different sectors that usually, I'd say, it's not traditional to be running with them in that direction. Just to mention, we can talk about cybersecurity, big data, AI technologies that are all, I'd say, in ecosystems by themselves in Israel. Each one of them, I believe I can put the same numbers or similar numbers of deals and companies that are dealing with it. But I believe all of them has some touch, some Venn diagram that can work along with the fintech industry to contribute some extra edge or an extra component in the solution that the Israeli companies are offering to the global market. And I believe that specifically to the UAE market. It's a saying, again, in Israel, since the 1948, when we just established our country, we started with oranges. Agriculture was our main export. Today, I'd say that high tech and services are the main export. We see a drop, not a big one, but a very strong jump in the exports of services. And definitely fintech is part of this jump. These companies are leading our services exports. And I believe that this new market that's opening up for them will allow them to be a great ally for future activities for all this fintech realm that we see in Israel. The vast size of the UAE financial system is definitely a very valuable partner that can be for Israeli tech. The Israeli tech can benefit greatly from all the, let's say, different players that are sitting over there with the different structures and regulations that they work with, alongside with the large markets that the UAE financial system is connected to. On the other hand, the cutting edge solutions that our industry allows, I think would be very beneficial for the different aspects of this humongous industry in the target market and globally in general. I am speaking specifically on the UAE, again, as the director of the desk dealing with them, and I must admit this completes a lot of the time of my day is dealing with this new partner, but I think it's relevant for most of the world. Israel has some cutting edge to offer. Again, our office in the UAE is going to be the 46th one, but we have 45 different offices all over the world, as you can see behind me, and each one of them deals with the same issues. We all trying to help make this world a little better, and in this case, make our life on the financial sector a little better. I believe that the short distance to our new friendly neighbors will also allow better ease of doing business and closer relationships. A lot of times we see that the Israeli companies are struggling a bit with working abroad and working in long distances. And the fact that we can finally work with, I'd say, a local partner even, in a 2-3 hour flight would allow much closer and deep relationships between the Israeli and UAE companies. And I'd like to finish with maybe a few points for our Israeli listeners and audience that are thinking to jump into this very promising market. And I think there's a few points we as Israelis and me as government need to point out for those coming partners. And I think first is the importance to understand that this is not only a very developed market, but this is also a market that's being regulated in a very different way than what we know. If I'll just mention, let's say, the big players, or the ones that you'll see in the newspapers, it's the Abu Dhabi Global Market and the Dubai International Financial Center. Those two places are, again, a very big hub to be taken into consideration. But this is something to be taken into consideration also because they have a different regulation, not only from the rest of the world, but also from the UAE. There's a big differentiation between working onshore in the UAE normally, I would say, or in one of those centers that is considered in a way a free trade zone that deals with a very different regulation. And Israeli companies need to take into consideration that it's not only, again, choosing to work in the UAE market. You need to choose where are you operating in the UAE market. Again, obviously not to frighten you not to get in. I believe that specifically those two sectors that we already spoke with, they have wonderful programs specifically for fintech companies. You have very beneficial regulatory sandboxes that allow you to operate there and allow you to get into the market in a slower pace, even to 6 to 24 months, that allow you to ease up to the regulation in the market and maybe even check specific products when you're getting in, specific benefits that will allow you to get into this market, hopefully, and roll out of it to new markets that we haven't dealt with in the past. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that similarly to what we used to do, I'd say in the 90s with Yozman, these kind of programs, our friends in the UAE have strategic plans for tens of years. These, I'd say, regulatory sandboxes and the financial districts fit in a very long-term strategic plan of UAE administration in order to allow the diversification of the different markets in the country. Israeli companies that are choosing to get into this market need to understand and see their part in those programs in order to be able to get into this operation and need to understand they are getting into an already running operation. This is a multi-year plan of our partners that if you see fit to get into, you need to understand and get into it, which also, I'd say, connects to the cultural differences. You need to pay attention. We need to be patient. Israelis are very known to be very fast, maybe aggressive sometimes. And it's important to understand that there's a lot for us to learn. For me personally, I can say that in the past few months, I've learned a lot of things that might be obvious in other eyes, but for us as Israelis, the people that have been dealing with a specific part of the world for all those years, there's a lot for us to understand. Specifically in the fintech sector, I would say that for me, all the Islamic banks and the Islamic ecosystem of banking was very new. This is something for the Israeli companies to take into consideration when you're stepping into the market. Your usual way of doing business might need to change a bit. And this is my place, again, to congratulate the organizers of this event. Again, to invite all the participants from the UAE to reach out to us. We'll be happy to work with you here in Israel. Israeli companies are already coming. As you've probably seen, the Israeli banks were the first ones to get on flights to the UAE. And we believe this is just the beginning. Hopefully out of this week, we'll see a lot of prosperity in those two sectors. And I wish us all good luck. Thank you.